pull up a map of Alaska. Not a tourist map, a real one. The kind where the roads run out and the blank space takes over. 3 dots. Anchorage, Fairbanks, the Arctic coast. Draw a line between them. More people vanish inside that triangle every year than almost anywhere else on Earth. 10 people. 10 places they should have come home from. None of them did. Lock your doors, pull up that map, and let's get into it. June 3rd, 2019. 12:30 in the morning. A house off McGrath Road in Fairbanks, Alaska, where the streetlights thin out and the boreal forest quietly takes over. Shanna Marie Oman is 39 years old. She's an Eagle River native, strawberry blonde, 5'7", the kind of person her family describes as genuinely, quietly caring. She's a mother of 3 daughters. She's been navigating a separation, which is never easy, and she's been staying with a friend in Fairbanks for a few days to get some distance from the stress of it. Normal enough. The plan, when she was ready to go home, was equally simple. Her friend would drive her back to Eagle River. No fuss, no complications. That night, for reasons that were never fully explained, the ride didn't happen. Shanna apparently made other arrangements, or at least that's what everyone assumed. Her friend went to sleep. Shanna walked out into the Fairbanks dark. Here's the first detail that matters, and it matters a lot. She left everything behind: her money, her belongings, and her dog. You don't leave your dog behind if you're planning to go somewhere real. You don't leave your money behind if you're running from something. Whatever Shanna was doing when she walked out that door at 12:30 in the morning, it didn't look like a departure. It looked like someone stepping out briefly, someone who fully intended to come back, pick up the dog, grab her things, and continue with her life. She didn't come back. The next morning, her roommate back in Eagle River called the friend's house in Fairbanks. Shanna had never arrived home. That's when the phone call started, the careful questions, the slow and nauseating realization spreading through the people who loved her, that nobody, not one person, could actually account for where she had gone after she walked out that door. Then, on June 4th, she surfaced, briefly. A remote cabin near mile 23 on Shanna Hot Springs Road. That's roughly 20 miles northeast of downtown Fairbanks. It's out where the road cuts through a narrow corridor of boreal spruce and birch, and the Shanna River runs cold and fast just off the shoulder. The cabin owner would later tell authorities that Shanna had been there. She'd shown up at the property. And then, according to him, she simply walked away. Walked away. Into what exactly? This is where it stops being normal. Mile 23, Shanna Hot Springs Road. The Shanna River pressing against one side of the corridor. Dense, dark timber on the other. No bus stop. No neighboring house within reasonable walking distance. No logical destination for a woman on foot, with no money, who left her dog behind at a house 6 miles back toward the city. And the road itself, at that hour, in that stretch, is not a place you linger if you have somewhere to be, or it is the kind of road that makes you feel how far you are from everything. And then, sometime on June 4th, Shanna's cell phone pings a tower near mile 17 on the same road, 6 miles back toward Fairbanks, from where she'd last been seen at the cabin. The battery is dying. The signal is faint. And that ping, that single fading transmission from a dying phone on a dark road in the boreal forest, is the last known trace of Shanna Marie Oman. 6 miles. That's the gap that defines this case. Between the cabin at mile 23, where someone last placed her alive, and the cell tower near mile 17 that caught her phone's final signal, there are 6 miles of wilderness, running alongside a river that search and rescue teams will tell you is one of the most unforgiving in interior Alaska. The Shanna River moves fast. The water stays cold well into summer, and it does not give things back easily. Alaska state troopers launched their helicopter to fly the entire corridor. Search and rescue teams deployed tracking dogs along the riverbank. The cabin property itself was searched with the owner's full cooperation. Searchers went through the brush, along the water's edge, across every reasonable approach and exit point they could identify. They found nothing. No footprints leading to the water. No clothing snagged on brush or caught in a root along the bank. No sign of a struggle at the cabin or on the road. No witness who'd seen a woman walking along the shoulder in the early hours of June 4th. No vehicle that had stopped. Nothing. And here's what doesn't make sense. And this is the contradiction that keeps pulling investigators and family members back to this case years later. The phone pinged at mile 17. Mile 17 is closer to Fairbanks than mile 23. That means at some point after leaving the cabin, Shanna was moving back toward the city, or at least her phone was, which suggests she wasn't walking deeper into the wilderness. She was, at some point, heading toward people, toward roads, toward help or home or something familiar. And then she stopped. The phone died, and the road gave up nothing. No one picked her up. No gas station camera on that stretch caught a figure walking the shoulder. No driver came forward to say they'd seen a woman out there. The 6 miles between the cabin and that cell tower should contain an explanation. Instead, they contain silence, and the theories live in that silence, and they are worth naming, carefully and without certainty. The river is the one most searchers return to. A fast current, cold water, a steep, muddy bank in the dark, a slip that nobody witnessed. It's physically possible. The Shanna at that stretch can carry a person downstream faster than searchers on foot can follow. And recovery from that kind of current in those temperatures is not guaranteed. But it is unconfirmed. There is no physical evidence that Shanna entered the water. No clothing on the bank, no disturbance in the mud at the edge. The river theory is plausible. It is not proven. The second theory is harder to say out loud, and the case file doesn't point a finger. But it exists in the gap between what the cabin owner reported and what the evidence actually shows. She didn't just walk away from a remote cabin at night with no money and no destination. People don't do that for no reason. Whatever happened at mile 23, whatever the conversation was, whatever the circumstances were when Shanna left, that cabin is the last place a living person confirmed seeing her. And cooperated with the search is not the same as fully explained everything that happened. The third possibility sits somewhere in between. Exhaustion, disorientation, the particular kind of collapse that hits people who have been carrying too much for too long. Alaska has taken people that way. The dark and the cold and the silence of the boreal corridor don't ask what your plans were. What's left, 5 years later? A missing poster on a tree near mile 17. The Shanna River moving behind it in the dark. Slow and cold and indifferent. Shanna's 3 daughters are still waiting for an answer. Her dog waited at that Fairbanks house for a while too. Her money sat untouched. Her belongings stayed exactly where she left them. She was 39. She was supposed to be coming back. And that, a cell tower ping near mile 17, a battery dying, June 4th, 2019, is the last confirmed moment anyone can place Shanna Marie Oman anywhere on Earth. After that, the Shanna Hot Springs corridor goes quiet, and it has stayed quiet ever since. Shanna vanished on a rural road in the dark. The next person on this list disappeared from a city hotel room, with witnesses watching the whole thing happen. Anchorage, Alaska. June 18th, 2001. A Super 8 motel on Minnesota Drive, sitting in the functional, an unglamorous stretch of the city where the chain hotels and the strip malls run together, and nobody pays much attention to who comes and goes. Thomas Anthony Nuzzi is 52 years old. He's a registered nurse, a Vietnam veteran who spent 7 years working assignments across Alaska, living out of hotels and a storage unit, moving from posting to posting with a practicality that suited him. He didn't need much. A room, his red Jeep Cherokee, his cigarettes, the work. He had one close friend in the city, a man named Harold Guernsey. And by most accounts, he was cheerful, dutiful, and quietly content with the life he'd built in the margins of the state. He had just finished an assignment in Ketchikan and returned to Anchorage to turn around quickly. On June 19th, he was due to fly to Bethel for his next posting, one night in the Super 8, a simple layover between one job and the next. Thomas Nuzzi had done it dozens of times. On the evening of June 18th, he left the motel and walked to a nearby gas station. This is documented. At 9:47 in the evening, a surveillance camera captured him at the register, buying cigarettes, 2 lighters, chips, and a soda. Routine. The kind of purchase that doesn't mean anything until later, when it becomes the last confirmed image of a man who was supposed to board a plane the following morning. Here's the detail that makes the gas station footage strange. In the footage, there is a thin, dark-haired woman standing beside him. She is not identified. She is never identified. At 9:47 in the evening on June 18th, 2001, Thomas Nuzzi was not alone. He returned to the motel. And then, at some point after that, something shifted. Harold Guernsey called Nuzzi's room that evening to check in before the Bethel flight. A man answered the phone. The man sounded nothing like Thomas Nuzzi. Guernsey, confused, pushed back, asked to speak to Tom. The man on the other end of the line handed the phone to a woman. The woman told Guernsey that Nuzzi had checked out. Then she hung up. Quickly, Guernsey would later say. Nervously. This is where it stops being normal. Thomas Nuzzi had not checked out. His belongings were in that room. His red 1997 Jeep Cherokee was in the parking lot. And 2 people, a man who didn't sound like him, and a thin, dark-haired woman, were apparently inside his room, answering his phone and telling his closest friend in the city that he was gone. The motel housekeeper went to service the room and knocked on the door, and a young woman answered. Behind her, visible through the open door, a man was lying on the floor. The door closed. The housekeeper left and returned hours later. This time, a different man was sitting on the bed. He told her to leave. 2 different men, the same woman, in Thomas Nuzzi's room. And across the street from the motel, witnesses reported seeing a couple breaking into Nuzzi's red Jeep Cherokee. And that is the last confirmed time anyone saw Thomas Anthony Nuzzi or had any meaningful contact with him. 9:47 in the evening, June 18th, 2001. A gas station receipt stamped with a time he had no idea would become the most important document in his disappearance. The Jeep turned up 12 miles north of Anchorage. Alpenglow's ski area parking lot, Chugach State Park. A remote lot, mostly empty outside ski season. He's sitting at the edge of a park that covers nearly 500,000 acres of mountain terrain. The Jeep was there. The keys were inside the ignition. Thomas Nuzzi was not. Think about what that requires. 12 miles from the Super 8 on Minnesota Drive to that parking lot. Nuzzi's bicycle, the one he used to get around the city, was later found at his storage unit, meaning he hadn't ridden out there. Someone drove that Jeep to the Alpenglow lot, left the keys inside, and walked away. Either Thomas Nuzzi drove it there himself, for reasons nobody can explain, or someone else did. Both options are disturbing in different ways. Here's what doesn't make sense. Nuzzi had a flight to catch the next morning. He had a job waiting in Bethel. He had no history of disappearing, no reason to run, and no known conflicts that would explain abandoning his vehicle in a remote ski lot with the keys in the ignition. Everyone who knew him said the same thing. This was not a man who walked away from his life. The Anchorage Police Department's initial response became its own source of bitterness for Guernsey, who later told investigators that when he first reported Nuzzi missing, he was told there were no available detectives. A middle-aged man, unhoused by choice, living out of hotels. Guernsey was blunt about what he believed that meant. Middle-aged guy, he said. They don't seem to care too much. Guernsey began conducting his own investigation. He traced phone calls made from Nuzzi's room after 9:47 in the evening. Calls to pagers, to motels, to a halfway house somewhere in the city. None of the people at the other end of those calls recognized Nuzzi's name or description. The calls were made from his room, on his phone, after he was last seen on camera. Someone was using Thomas Nuzzi's room as a base of operations. Whether Nuzzi was alive when those calls were made is officially unknown. 2 detectives were eventually assigned to the case. The investigation stalled. The thin, dark-haired woman from the gas station footage was never identified. The man with the distinctive teeth, described by the housekeeper and others, was never identified. The couple seen breaking into the Jeep left no traceable evidence behind. The Chugach State Park terrain around Alpenglow was searched. Nearly 500,000 acres of mountain, forest, and glacial moraine, or with trails that run out fast and wilderness that runs on for a very long time after that. Nothing was found. No clothing. No remains. No sign that a man had ever walked out of that parking lot or into that park. What's left is a receipt. 9:47 in the evening. 2 lighters, chips, a soda, cigarettes. A thin, dark-haired woman standing beside him in the frame. A Jeep in an empty lot, with the keys still in the ignition, 12 miles from where he was supposed to sleep. A phone in his room that strangers answered, making calls he never made. Thomas Anthony Nuzzi was supposed to be in Bethel on June 19th. He never boarded that flight. He has not been seen since. Thomas had strangers in his room, and nobody saw what happened to him. The next case is different. Jael Hamlin walked out of her own front door. And when searchers finally found something 5 months later, it had been buried in the snow. Anchorage, Alaska. October 11th, 2014. A residential neighborhood in the Trailside Loop area, where the suburbs press up against the edge of the Chugach foothills, and the temperatures in mid-October are already dropping hard at night. Jael Tiara Hamlin is 20 years old. She was born in Washington State, raised in Wasilla, and she had recently become a mother. Her infant son Joel was just a few months old. Family members would later describe the way motherhood had changed her. She had been through difficult stretches earlier in life, but Joel had grounded her, focused her, given her something to organize her days around. She had pink-dyed hair and green eyes, and a black pea coat she wore when she went out. She was, and by every account from the people closest to her, doing better than she had in years. She was living with a roommate named Kendra Estrada. That evening, October 11th, the 2 of them had gone to a Friday's restaurant for dinner. Normal, low-key. They were home by 10 o'clock. Kendra's mother was watching the children. Kendra went to bed. Jael showered, went to her room, and the apartment went quiet. At 1:40 in the morning, Jael sent a text message to a male friend. The message was brief, and it was troubled. She wrote that she was crying, that she wanted to go out. It was the kind of text that, in isolation, might not alarm anyone. Young people send messages like that. It was late. She was emotional. She wanted company or movement or something to pull her out of whatever she was sitting with at 1:40 in the morning. Yes, the night continued. More texts. And then, just after 3 in the morning, Jael had a final text exchange with a second man. The content of that exchange has not been fully disclosed publicly. What is documented is that it was her last contact with anyone. After 3 in the morning, her phone went dark. Not silent, dark, dead, off. No further signal, no further pings, no delivery receipts on any message sent to her after that point. In the morning, Kendra sent Jael a text. It didn't deliver. She knocked on Jael's bedroom door around noon. The bed was unmade. The room was empty. Jael's Ford Expedition was still parked in the driveway. Her infant son Joel was still in the apartment, asleep. Here's the critical detail. Jael left on foot, in high heels, in sub-freezing temperatures, with only her purse and her dead phone. She left her car. She left her baby. Every person who knew Jael Hamlin said the same thing when investigators told them she had walked out and left Joel behind. They said it wasn't possible. Not this version of her. Not the mother she had become. Whatever pulled her out of that apartment at some point between 1:40 and 3 in the morning, it was not a choice she made with a clear head and a settled heart. Something had gone very wrong before she ever reached the front door. This is where it stops being normal. Because the picture that emerges when you lay the timeline flat is not a woman who decided to leave. It's a woman who was already in crisis before she left, texting 2 different men in the middle of the night, crying, phone dying, and then walking out into an Anchorage October in shoes that were not made for pavement in the dark, let alone a trail. And here is the thing about the trail. Investigators looking into Jael's movements after she left the apartment began to focus on a trail in the Trailside Loop area, a route running along the foothills near the neighborhood. Jael had no history of hiking that trail. It was not a place she went. There was no reason, none that anyone could identify, for her to walk in that direction on foot, in heels, in the cold, at 3 in the morning. But that appears to be the direction she went. The search in the weeks immediately following her disappearance turned up nothing. Police confirmed her phone had gone completely inactive after the 3 in the morning texts. Scent searches along the trail were inconclusive. The cold complicated everything. Tracking becomes harder when the ground is frozen, or when wind strips scent from surfaces, when darkness and temperature narrow the window of what's recoverable. Anchorage police eventually reclassified the case. Probable homicide. Someone, they concluded, had harmed Jael Hamlin. Then came March 2015, 5 months after she walked out of that apartment. Hikers on a trail in Chugiak, a community about 20 miles north of the Trailside Loop area, found a purse buried in the snow. Not dropped. Not left on a bench or beside a path. Buried, covered, deliberately placed beneath the surface. Inside the purse, an iPhone and Jael Hamlin's social security card. Anchorage police confirmed it was hers. They also confirmed something that reframed the entire case in a single sentence. Jael did not place the purse there herself. The manner in which it was buried, the distance from her home, and the location relative to any path she would have walked, investigators were unambiguous. Someone else buried that purse. Someone who had it or took it, and then drove or walked it 20 miles north and put it under the snow. Here's what doesn't make sense. Or rather, here's what makes a terrible kind of sense once you accept what the evidence is actually saying. A purse doesn't bury itself. A dead phone doesn't travel 20 miles on its own. Jael walked out of her apartment in the early hours of October 12, 2014. And at some point, on that road, on that trail, in the dark, she encountered someone. And that someone, at some point after the encounter, buried her belongings in the snow in Chugiak and walked away. 2 men received her texts that night. 2 men, one at 1:40 in the morning, one at 3 in the morning. And neither has been publicly charged. Neither has been publicly cleared. The investigation into who those men were, what they said to her, whether either of them came to meet her or directed her somewhere in the dark. That thread has never been cut cleanly in any public record. Jael's son Joel was too young to understand what was happening when his mother didn't come back. He was too young to remember her face, her pink hair, the black pea coat she wore when she went out. He was too young to ask questions that morning when Kendra knocked on the bedroom door and found the room empty. He's old enough now. Jael's case remains open. Her body has never been found. The trail in Chugiak, where her purse was buried, has been walked hundreds of times since 2015 by people who had no idea what had happened there. The snow that covered it has melted and returned and melted again 5 times over. What's left is a purse under 5 months of snow, a social security card, a phone with no activity after 3 in the morning, and a trail that a 20-year-old mother in high heels had no reason to be on in the dark. Jael's purse was buried. The next case is different. Anisha Mernain walked out of her apartment building in broad daylight on a main street, heading to a doctor's appointment 1 mile away. The dogs tracked her scent through downtown Homer and then lost it mid-street, like she had simply been lifted out of the world. Homer, Alaska. October 17th, 2019, 12:15 in the afternoon. Homer is a small coastal town on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula, minus the kind of place where people know each other by name, and a walk down Pioneer Avenue, the main street, means passing familiar faces, familiar storefronts, familiar rhythms. It is not a place where people disappear. It is not a place where a nearly 6-foot-tall woman can vanish from the middle of the day without someone noticing. Or at least, that's what you would think. Anisha Mernain, known to everyone who loved her as Duffy, is 38 years old. She has a master's degree in education. She has lived and worked in Honduras, in Australia, in Seattle. A life built around teaching, around movement, around being useful to people. She came back to Homer for her health. She has a bipolar diagnosis, but she is medicated, she is stable, and by every account from her mother Sarah and the people close to her, she is doing reasonably well. She is quiet. She is kind. She is, in the language people use when they're trying to make you understand who someone really was, genuinely gentle. She lives at an apartment building on Pioneer Avenue. On the morning of October 17th, she has a 1 o'clock appointment at a local health clinic. The clinic is 1 mile from her front door, along Homer's main street, in the middle of the day. She doesn't have a car. She walks. She has done this kind of thing before. There is nothing unusual about the plan. At 12:15 in the afternoon, a security camera outside her building captures Duffy leaving on foot. She's heading toward Pioneer Avenue. She's heading toward her appointment. She's 1 mile from where she needs to be, with 45 minutes to get there, on a clear October afternoon in a town of roughly 5,000 people. She never arrives. The clinic calls. No one answers. The afternoon passes. By evening, Sarah Mernain knows something is wrong. Her daughter does not miss appointments. Her daughter does not go silent. By the time the calls to Alaska State Troopers are made and the machinery of a missing persons case begins to turn, Duffy has already been gone for hours. And the trail, such as it is already going cold. Here's the critical detail, and it is the kind of detail that reorients everything. When search dogs were deployed the following weekend, They tracked Duffy's scent from her building down through downtown Homer, along Pioneer Avenue, through the area near a local restaurant called Cosmic Kitchen. They followed her path block by block, nose to the ground, pulling the handlers forward through the ordinary geography of a small Alaskan coastal town on a Thursday afternoon. And then the scent ended. Not at a building, not at a trail, not at the water's edge or the tree line or any place that suggested she had stopped or fallen or turned around. The scent ended in the middle of Pioneer Avenue, on the main street of Homer, Alaska, in broad daylight. The handlers had a name for what that means when it happens. They called it a car pickup. Someone pulled over. Duffy got in, or Duffy was put in, and after that, there is nothing. This is where it stops being normal, though in truth, it stopped being normal the moment a nearly 6-foot woman vanished from a main street at noon without a single witness coming forward to say they saw anything out of the ordinary. Homer is not a city, and it is not a place where you can move through the middle of the day unnoticed. And yet, the security camera at her building is the last footage anyone has of Anisha Mernain, alive or otherwise. No bank card activity, no phone activity. Alaska State Troopers helicopters flew the area. Search dogs were deployed twice, tracking dogs and human remains detection dogs, combing the entirety of Homer's city limits. A dedicated investigator was assigned solely to Duffy's case, which speaks to how seriously the disappearance was being taken, and also to how little progress was being made. The searches turned up nothing. The investigation turned in slow circles. Sandra Mernain kept calling. The community kept searching. Homer kept looking at itself and asking how this had happened on Pioneer Avenue on a Thursday afternoon, and no one had seen anything. So for 3 years, the case produced nothing. Then, in 2022, an anonymous tip came in. The tipster named a man, Kirby Calderwood, 32 years old, a former employee at Duffy's building, the building where she lived. The building she walked out of at 12:15 in the afternoon on October 17, 2019. The tipster, it would later emerge, was Calderwood's wife. Investigators traveled to Utah, where Calderwood was living. In his possession, they found a watch, a Timex. It matched the description of the watch Duffy had been wearing the day she disappeared. A watch belonging to a missing woman from Homer, Alaska, in the home of a former building employee in Utah, 3 years after she walked out of that building and into a car on Pioneer Avenue. Kirby Calderwood was arrested in May 2022. Here's what doesn't make sense, or rather, here is the thing that the guilty plea confirmed, and the missing body makes permanently, unbearably incomplete. Calderwood worked at the building where Duffy lived. He knew her routine, or could have learned it. He knew when she left. He knew the route she walked. A predator positioned by the ordinary mechanics of employment, directly inside the life of a woman who trusted that her building was safe, that her neighborhood was safe, that a 1-mile walk to a doctor's appointment in the middle of the day in Homer, Alaska was one of the safest things she could do. In February 2026, Kirby Calderwood entered a guilty plea. Sentencing is scheduled for July 2026. The question of what happened to Duffy, the mechanism, the location, the disposal, remains, in the official record, unknown. Calderwood has not led investigators to her remains. Sandra Mernain cannot bury her daughter. The family has an answer to who and no answer to where. That distinction between knowing and being able to grieve fully, between a conviction and a grave to stand beside, is its own particular cruelty. The criminal case moves toward its conclusion. The search for Duffy continues in parallel, quieter now, with less urgency in the news cycle, but no less weight for the people carrying it. What's left is a security camera frame. 12:15 in the afternoon. A woman walking out of her building toward a 1-mile errand on a clear October afternoon. Pioneer Avenue behind her, ordinary and gray and completely indifferent to what was about to happen on it. She was 38. She was kind. She trusted that the main street of her hometown was safe in the middle of the day. The Duffy vanished on a main street in broad daylight. The next case takes us off the land entirely, onto the water, inside a sealed ship surrounded by thousands of people, where a woman disappeared, and the company spent the better part of a month pretending she had never existed. Seattle, Washington. August 27, 2004. A cruise terminal on the waterfront where the celebrity cruises Mercury is preparing to depart for a 7-day voyage up the Alaska Inside Passage. Juneau, Skagway, Ketchikan. The cold green water and the glaciers and the kind of scenery that makes people feel, briefly, like the world is still large and wild and worth moving through. Marion Carver is 40 years old. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She's a former investment banker, sharp, independent, adventurous in the way that people who have built their own lives tend to be. She has a 13-year-old daughter. She is divorced. She has a history of solo travel, of booking trips and going alone and coming back with stories. And so when she boards the Mercury on August 27th, without telling anyone where she is going, it fits a pattern that the people in her life have learned to accept. Marion moves through the world on her own terms. She always comes back. She books a cabin. She settles in. The ship pulls away from Seattle and heads north into the Inside Passage, into the cold blue corridor between the mainland and the islands where the water is deep and the distances between points of help are longer than they look on a map. On August 28th, the second day of the voyage, a cabin steward named Domingo Montero brings room service to Marion's cabin. Sandwiches. She answers the door. They interact briefly. She mentions, in passing, that she is planning to go up to the deck later. It is an ordinary thing to say. It is the kind of thing people say on cruise ships when the light is good and the scenery is moving past the railings and there is nothing else that needs doing. That is the last confirmed contact anyone has with Marion Carver. The next morning, Domingo Montero returns to service her cabin. The bed has not been slept in. On the nightstand, there is a manila envelope. The contents of that envelope have never been publicly disclosed. Her belongings are in the cabin, her clothes, her personal items, everything she brought aboard. And here is the detail that investigators and her family would return to again and again in the months that followed. Her shoes. Her only pair of shoes is still in the cabin. Every shoe she brought on the voyage is sitting on the floor of a room she never came back to. Think about what that means for a moment. You cannot board a lifeboat in bare feet without someone noticing. You cannot walk the length of a cruise ship past crew members and fellow passengers without shoes, without it registering in someone's memory. Marion Carver's shoes are in her cabin. Whatever happened to her happened before she put them on, or happened in a place she reached without needing them, or happened in a way that made shoes irrelevant. Domingo Montero reports her missing to his supervisor. This is where it stops being normal. Not because of what happened to Marion, but because of what happened next, inside the machinery of the ship, in the hours and days that followed. The supervisor's response to Montero's report is 4 words. 4 words that set in motion a chain of institutional failures so complete, so deliberate, so damaging, that it would eventually cost the cruise line hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal costs and public scrutiny, and would cost Marion Carver's family a month of their lives, not knowing whether she had ever boarded the ship at all. The supervisor told Montero, "Just do your job." Montero did not do just his job. To his credit, and this matters, because without him, the timeline would have collapsed entirely. Domingo Montero reported Marion Carver missing every single day for the remaining 5 days of the cruise. Every day. To supervisors, to whoever would listen, to whoever he could find with the authority to do something. Every day, he was told some version of the same thing. Not our problem. Move on. Do your job. The ship stopped in Juneau. Marion Carver did not disembark. It stopped in Skagway. She did not disembark. Ketchikan, Prince Rupert, British Columbia. At each port, passengers came and went. Marion Carver did not appear at any gangway, did not pass any checkpoint, did not surface in any way that would suggest she had left the ship voluntarily at any stop along the route. The cruise ended in Vancouver. The Mercury docked. Passengers disembarked. And then, under orders from a supervisor, the crew boxed up Marion Carver's belongings. Her clothing, including presumably those shoes, was donated to charity. Her cabin was cleared and prepared for the next voyage. No police report was filed. No port authority was notified. No FBI contact was made. The ship turned around and prepared for its next departure. And whatever had happened to a 40-year-old woman from Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the second night of a 7-day cruise was folded quietly into the ordinary business of a ship that needed to keep moving. Here's the critical detail, and it is almost impossible to process without anger. Celebrity Cruises did not contact the FBI until 5 weeks after Marion Carver disappeared. 5 weeks. The ship had completed additional voyages. The cabin had been turned over, and the belongings were gone. The crew members who had been aboard during the relevant voyage had dispersed to other assignments. The video surveillance footage, which operated on a cycle the cruise line would later acknowledge ran for 30 days before being overwritten, had been reviewed internally 26 days after the disappearance. What that internal review found, and what it concluded, was not shared with the Carver family. The way the family found out that Marion had even been on the ship is its own indictment of the process. Her daughter, living in England, grew concerned when the calls and messages she expected from her mother didn't come. Her grandfather, Kendall Carver, reported her missing to Cambridge police. Investigators began tracing Marion's credit card activity and eventually, 26 days after she disappeared, traced her last known movements to a boarding pass for the Celebrity Cruises Mercury out of Seattle. 26 days. The cabin had already been cleaned. The shoes had already been donated. The supervisor who had told Montero to do his job had already, in the reckoning that followed, been fired. But fired is not the same as investigated. And investigated is not the same as charged. And charged is not the same as any of the answers the Carver family was looking for. The family hired a private investigator and sent him to the ship. He was denied access to crew members for interviews. He was told that video footage was erased every 2 to 3 weeks, a timeline that turned out to be inconsistent with the 30-day cycle the line later acknowledged. The Carver family would ultimately spend $75,000 of their own money attempting to find out what had happened to Marianne on a ship full of people, in a sealed environment, on a route where there was nowhere to go except the water. What was she doing on the deck that night? That question doesn't have a public answer. The observation deck on the Mercury sits roughly 100 feet above the waterline. It is a short walk from where her cabin was located. It is, at night, in the inside passage, one of the most beautiful and isolated places you can stand on a moving ship. Dark water in every direction, the mountains invisible in the dark, the cold coming off the channel. And it is, at that height, in that darkness, a place from which a person can disappear without anyone on the decks below knowing it happened. The case has never been resolved. Royal Caribbean, Celebrity's parent company, issued a statement at one point characterizing Marion's disappearance as a suicide, without presenting evidence to support that conclusion. The family disputes it. They acknowledge she had experienced episodes of depression in her past. They do not accept that a characterization without forensic grounding constitutes an answer. What's left is a nightstand, a manila envelope with unknown contents, a pair of shoes on a cabin floor, and a supervisor's voice saying 4 words that erased a month of time and most of what could have been known. Just do your job. We are not done with Marion Carver. The cover-up, and what the family found when they kept pulling, goes deeper. That is next. Let's go back to the ship. Because here is the thing about the Celebrity Cruises Mercury case that the 5-week delay and the donated clothing and the fired supervisor don't fully capture. The institutional failure in Marion Carver's disappearance was not a single bad decision made by one negligent employee on one bad night. It was a cascade, a series of choices, made by multiple people at multiple levels of a large corporation that had the cumulative effect of destroying the evidentiary window that might have told the Carver family what happened to their daughter on the second night of a 7-day cruise. And when the family pushed back, when Kendall Carver and the private investigator and the lawyers began pulling threads, what they found was not a company scrambling to correct its mistakes. What they found was a wall. The private investigator the family hired arrived at the ship with specific requests. He wanted to speak to crew members who had been aboard during the relevant voyage. He wanted to review whatever surveillance footage existed. He wanted to walk the route between Marion's cabin and the observation deck and understand, physically, what that journey looked like at night. Every one of those requests was denied or obstructed in some form. Crew interviews, unavailable. Footage, described initially as erased on a 2 to 3 week cycle. The physical layout of the ship, accessible, but without the context that crew testimony would have provided, largely useless. Here's the critical detail about the footage timeline, because it matters more than it might seem. Celebrity Cruises initially told investigators and the family that surveillance video was routinely erased every 2 to 3 weeks. That would mean that by the time anyone outside the company was looking for footage from August 28th, it was already gone. Routine. Unfortunate. Nothing to be done. Except that was not the actual cycle. The actual retention period for footage on the Mercury, as the cruise line later acknowledged, was 30 days. Not 2 to 3 weeks. 30 days. And the internal review of that footage, conducted by the cruise line itself, without the involvement of law enforcement or the Carver family, happened on day 26, or 4 days before the footage would have been overwritten under the actual 30-day cycle. 4 days before an outside investigator with legal authority could have compelled its preservation. What that internal review found has never been fully disclosed publicly. What happened to the footage after day 30 is not part of the public record in any detail that has been made available to the Carver family. The supervisor who ordered Marion's belongings boxed and donated, who told Domingo Montero to do his job and forget it, who presided over 5 days of a missing passenger being reported and ignored. That supervisor was fired. The firing was treated, at least internally, as accountability. The family did not experience it as accountability. Accountability to the Carver family would have looked like answers, and the firing produced no answers. It produced a former employee and a closed door. The FBI eventually became involved, 5 weeks after Marion disappeared. By that point, the evidentiary landscape had been comprehensively degraded. The cabin was clean. The belongings were gone. The crew had dispersed. The footage window had closed. Whatever Domingo Montero had seen, whatever other crew members might have noticed on the night of August 28th, whatever the surveillance cameras had captured in the corridor outside Marion's cabin or on the route to the observation deck. All of it existed now only in human memory, which is the least reliable and least recoverable form of evidence there is. This is where it stops being a story about one woman and becomes something larger. Kendall Carver, Marion's father, did not stop when the FBI investigation stalled. He could not stop. He was a grandfather looking for his granddaughter's mother, and he had watched a corporation methodically dismantle the possibility of knowing what had happened to her, and he was not willing to accept that as the end of the story. Kendall Carver became one of the founding voices of International Cruise Victims, an advocacy organization that emerged directly from Marion's case and others like it. Cases where passengers disappeared from cruise ships and the response from the cruise lines was characterized by delay, obstruction, and a prioritization of operational continuity over the truth. He testified before Congress. He pushed for legislation that would require cruise lines to report missing passengers to the FBI within 24 hours, to preserve surveillance footage for a minimum period, to maintain a crew member trained in criminal investigation aboard every vessel. Some of those measures eventually became law. Marion Carver's name is part of the reason they exist. But legislation does not find a body. And the body, if there is a body, if the water gave it somewhere to rest, has never been found. There is one more development in this case, and it sits in the unresolved category firmly enough that it must be treated carefully. At some point after Marion's disappearance, the exact date is not clearly established in public records, bones were found on Mary Island, off the coast of British Columbia, Canada. The Mercury's route passed through those waters. The Carver family sought DNA testing to determine whether the bones were Marion's. The results of that testing, if completed, have not been confirmed in any public record available at the time this documentary was produced. The bones remain, officially, unidentified in the context of this case. Here's what doesn't make sense. Or rather, here is what the full picture of this case makes impossible to set aside. A woman disappears from a sealed vessel on the second night of a cruise. A steward reports it every day for 5 days and is ignored every day for 5 days. Her belongings are donated. Her cabin is cleaned. The footage is reviewed internally, and then the window closes. The FBI is called 5 weeks later. The family spends $75,000 and gets a wall. The supervisor is fired. The company characterizes the disappearance as a suicide without evidence. Bones are found on an island along the route. The DNA question remains unanswered in the public record. What is the through line? It is not incompetence, exactly. Incompetence is random. It makes mistakes in all directions. What happened aboard the Celebrity Cruises Mercury after August 28, 2004 moved in one direction consistently? Away from disclosure, away from preservation, away from the truth. That is a different thing than incompetence. Marion Carver was 40 years old. She was independent and adventurous, and she traveled alone because she was capable of it. Because she trusted that the structures around her, a ship full of crew members, a company with a duty of care, were adequate. She left her shoes in her cabin. She went up to the deck. And whatever happened after that was folded into the machinery of a corporation that had a different set of priorities than finding out the truth. Her father spent the rest of his life trying to make sure it couldn't happen to someone else's daughter. The manila envelope on the nightstand, the shoes on the floor, the supervisor's 4 words. That is what's left. The next case takes us off the water and up into the mountains. 17,400 feet up, onto a route that only 7 teams had ever completed, where two of the most accomplished female alpinists in North America climbed into a storm and left a backpack behind that told a story nobody wanted to read. Capita Glacier, Alaska Range, May 12, 2006. Base camp at the foot of Mount Foraker, east where the ice is flat and the sky is wide and the mountain above you is so large it reorganizes your sense of what large means. Sue Knott is 36 years old. She lives in Vail, Colorado. She is a sponsored mountain hardware athlete, a veteran of some of the most technically demanding alpine routes in North America. A woman who had put up first female ascents on multiple serious climbs and whose name, in the tight community of elite alpinists, carried the particular weight of someone who had earned every inch of her reputation. She had climbed the Cassin Ridge on Denali. She had been to places that most climbers only read about. Karen McNeil is 37 years old. She was born in New Zealand, lives in Canmore, Alberta, and she has spent 15 years building a climbing partnership with Sue Knott that produced first ascents in Patagonia, inks in Greenland, in ranges that don't appear on most people's maps. She is, by the assessment of everyone in the alpine community who knew her, operating at the same level as Knott. Technically precise, physically extraordinary, experienced enough to make good decisions in places where bad decisions are fatal. Together, in the spring of 2006, they are arguably the two most accomplished female alpinists in North America, and they have come to the Alaska Range to attempt something that, in 30 years of the route's existence, no woman has ever done: the Infinite Spur. A 9,400-foot ridge on the south face of Mount Foraker, rising from the Capita Glacier to a summit at 17,400 feet. It had been climbed only 7 times in the 30 years since its first ascent, and all 7 ascents had been made by 2-person male teams. The route is long, committing, technically complex, and unforgiving in the way that only a remote Alaskan peak can be. Meaning that if something goes wrong high on the Infinite Spur, there is no cavalry. There is no helicopter that can operate at that altitude in those conditions. There is no one coming. You solve the problem yourself, or the problem ends you. Knott and McNeil registered with the National Park Service as a team they called Turtle Team. They packed 14 days of food and fuel. Their planned return date was June 10th. On May 14th, climbers on an adjacent route saw them at the base of the Infinite Spur, safe, moving well, beginning their ascent. That is the last confirmed outside contact with either woman. Everything after May 14th is reconstruction, inference, and the story that the mountain told searchers through the objects it gave back and the tracks it briefly revealed. On June 1st, with Knott and McNeil overdue and no radio contact established, the air taxi operator flew the route. He did not see them. The National Park Service launched an aerial search, and on June 2nd, at approximately 11,500 feet on the south face of Foraker, searchers found Sue Knott's backpack in an avalanche debris field. This is where it stops being normal. The pack was not empty. Inside it, a sleeping bag, a foam sleeping pad, a radio, battery still functional, that had never transmitted a distress call because the woman who carried it was no longer carrying it. The pack had not been cached deliberately. There was no note, no signal, or no indication that Knott had left it intentionally as part of a planned strategy. It was in an avalanche debris field at 11,500 feet. Something had separated Sue Knott from her sleeping bag and her radio at 11,500 feet on the Infinite Spur. The following day, June 3rd, searchers found a yellow bag, a fleece hat, and a pink jacket nearby. More gear, more confirmation that something had gone wrong in that debris field, at that elevation, on that face. Here's the critical detail, the one that reorients everything. that takes this from a story about two climbers who fell and makes it into something stranger and more troubling. In the days that followed, aerial searchers identified tracks on the mountain, tracks at 14,800 feet, and then tracks at 15,800 feet near the summit of Mount Foraker. Above the debris field where the pack was found, thousands of feet above it. Sue Knott and Karen McNeil, after losing the pack at 11,500 feet, after losing the sleeping bag and the radio and the foam pad, after whatever event in that avalanche debris field separated them from their gear, continued climbing. They went up. 4,000 feet of additional climbing, above the point where they lost their safety margin, above the point where the rational calculation might have suggested turning around, up toward a 17,400-foot summit in the Alaska Range in early June. In alpine climbing, this is not as irrational as it sounds from the outside. Sometimes the route above is safer than the descent below, and sometimes the summit provides access to an easier way down on the far side. Sometimes two experienced climbers look at the mountain and make a decision that is entirely logical given the information they have in that moment. And the decision is still fatal. The mountains don't grade on a curve. They don't reward good reasoning. They reward outcomes. The weather during that window, the days when Knott and McNeil would have been at the summit and attempting descent, was severe. Confirmed wind speeds of 60 miles per hour at 14,000 feet on neighboring Denali. On Foraker, which sits without Denali's partial windbreak, conditions would have been worse. At altitude, in those winds, in early June in the Alaska Range, the survival calculus changes fast. Fuel runs out. Without fuel, you cannot melt snow. Without water, the body begins to shut down within 3 days. A snow cave becomes a shelter, and then, as the hours accumulate, becomes something else. National Park Service investigators, after extensive aerial search and consultation with experienced alpinists who knew the route, reached a conclusion. It is labeled here as their official conclusion, not a confirmed discovery, because the women were never found. The National Park Service concluded that Knott and McNeil likely summited Mount Foraker, attempted to descend via an alternate route, were pinned down by the extreme weather, built a snow cave near the summit, and died there. From hypothermia, from asphyxiation as the snow cave's ventilation failed, from the simple arithmetic of fuel and water and temperature and time running out simultaneously at 17,000 feet. When the National Park Service suspended the aerial search on July 10, 2006, after more than 28 hours of flight time over the Alaska Range, the terrain danger to potential rescue personnel was cited. There was no further trace to follow. The search ended not because the answer had been found, but because the mountain had made clear it was not going to give one. Here's what doesn't make sense, or rather, here is the detail that has stayed with everyone who knows this case in the nearly 20 years since it happened. Mount Foraker has been climbed repeatedly since 2006. Expeditions have gone up the Infinite Spur and other routes, have passed through the elevation bands where Knott and McNeil were last tracked, have moved through the terrain where the National Park Service believes the snow cave was located. Nobody has found them. Yet in the mountains, this happens. Snow moves. Glaciers carry things downward over years and decades. A snow cave at 17,000 feet is not a fixed point. It is a location in a medium that flows slowly, constantly, in directions determined by gravity and ice dynamics rather than by the needs of the people looking. Sue Knott and Karen McNeil are, in all probability, still on Mount Foraker. The mountain simply hasn't returned them yet. What's left is a backpack in an avalanche field at 11,500 feet. A radio with good batteries that never transmitted. Tracks at 15,800 feet, pressing upward toward a summit in a storm. Two of the best climbers of their generation. and the mountain that was the last thing that knew where they were. The next case is different in almost every way. No altitude, just no storm, no technical climbing. Richard Griffith walked into the wilderness alone to test an invention. He built a device designed to keep people alive. And then he disappeared into 13 million acres of Alaskan wilderness. And nobody even noticed he was gone for over a year. Spokane, Washington. Summer 2006. A man loads his gear into a bus headed north toward Alaska, carrying an invention he believes in completely, heading into the wilderness to prove that it works. Richard Lyman Griffith is not easy to categorize. He grew up in Boca Raton, Florida, drifted through various chapters of his life with the restless, self-directed energy of someone who operates on his own frequency. His sister, Teddy, who would spend years trying to find out what happened to him, and described him in terms that capture the particular texture of someone like Richard. Imaginative, she said, charismatic in a way that could tip towards something harder to name. Always moving, always on to the next idea, the next place, the next version of the plan. The plan, in the summer of 2006, was the survival cocoon. Richard had invented it himself. A bright orange, insulated shelter, something between a sleeping bag and a bivouac sack, designed to keep a person alive in extreme wilderness conditions, visible from the air, thermally efficient. The kind of device that, if it worked the way Richard believed it worked, could mean the difference between a rescue and a recovery. He wanted to field test it in the Alaskan wilderness. He wanted to take it into real terrain, in real conditions, and demonstrate that it did what he had built it to do. He told friends he might spend the winter in Alaska. That detail matters enormously, because it is the detail that allowed an entire year to pass before anyone seriously asked where he was. Here's the critical detail about the reporting timeline, and it is one of the most quietly devastating elements of this case. Richard Griffith was the kind of person who moved without checking in regularly. His friends and acquaintances were accustomed to gaps in contact. When he stopped calling, when the messages stopped coming, nobody marked it as alarming because the plan had always included an extended stay. He had said he might winter over. So when winter came and went and Richard didn't surface, the people who knew him filed it under. Richard being Richard, doing his thing, off the grid somewhere in Alaska with his orange cocoon, proving his point. It was not until more than a year after he disappeared that anyone reported him missing. A year. In wilderness terms, a year is an eternity. Whatever physical evidence existed of Richard Griffith's movements, footprints, campsites, gear left behind, the orange cocoon itself had been through an Alaskan winter, a spring thaw, a summer of growth and rain and animal activity, and the beginning of another winter by the time searchers began looking. The trail was not cold. The trail was gone. What is known as this: a bus dropped Richard Griffith on the Alaska Highway in the summer of 2006. He checked into a lodge near the White River, in the remote corridor that runs along the Alaska-Yukon border, and on the western edge of what would eventually become relevant search territory. He left some of his gear at the lodge, not all of it, just some, the way a person does when they plan to come back. He told staff at the lodge that he intended to hike upriver toward McCarthy, Alaska, a small community at the edge of Wrangell St. Elias National Park, which is the largest national park in the United States, larger than Switzerland, larger than many countries, a landscape of glaciers and moraine and mountain corridors where the distances between human settlements are measured in days of walking rather than hours. In the zone between the White River Lodge and McCarthy, in the summer of 2006, foot traffic was essentially non-existent. There are no maintained trails connecting those points. There is no infrastructure. There are bare corridors and river crossings and glacial terrain that changes character season to season in ways that make navigation genuinely technical, even for experienced wilderness travelers. Richard Griffith walked into that corridor with his survival cocoon and was never seen again. This is where it stops being normal. Though the full weight of how abnormal it is doesn't land until you sit with the 1-year reporting delay and what it cost. Former Nabesna District Ranger Mike Thompson recalled, years later, a search that had been conducted in the fall of 2006 for a man and an orange cocoon in the White River area. The search produced nothing. Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers in Beaver Creek, Yukon, because the terrain Richard was moving through crosses the international border and jurisdiction becomes genuinely complicated in that part of the world, were contacted. Their files on the case were sparse. The officer who remembered the case could provide almost no details from the record. When the Anchorage Daily News investigated the case in 2014, 8 years after Richard disappeared, it was still generating zero physical evidence. His sister Teddy was still looking. The orange cocoon had never been spotted from the air, never been found on the ground, never turned up in any subsequent search of the White River corridor or the approaches to McCarthy. Here's what doesn't make sense, in the particular way that this case doesn't make sense. The cocoon was designed to be found. That was its entire purpose. High visibility, orange, the color that search and rescue pilots are trained to look for against the gray and green and white of Alaskan terrain. Richard Griffith walked into the wilderness carrying the most visible object he could have made, in a color chosen specifically to defeat the camouflage of the landscape. And it has never been seen. Not once. Not by any pilot, any hiker, any ranger, any subsequent expedition through that country in nearly 2 decades. Either the cocoon failed to perform its most basic function, which was to be visible, or it is buried under conditions, glacial movement, river flooding, permafrost collapse, that have placed it beyond the reach of aerial observation. Or Richard never used it, which means whatever happened to him happened fast enough that he didn't have time. None of those options are comforting. What's left is a man at a lodge on the White River, leaving some gear behind because he planned to come back, heading upriver toward a town at the edge of the largest national park in the country, and then 13 million acres of silence. Sandra Davis disappeared from a much smaller geography, a suburban road in Chugiak, Alaska, in 1974, in the particular quietness of a summer morning when the world was paying attention to something else entirely. Sandra is a Utah-born Mormon woman, a mother of 2, who had moved to Chugiak with her husband John Davis and settled into the particular isolation of an Alaskan suburban life in the early 1970s. No car of her own, no phone, a family that was her entire social world. She and John were in the process of a divorce. John had served her the papers, and the marriage was ending in the way that marriages sometimes end in small, closed communities, with tension and proximity and no easy exits. On August 30th, 1974, Sandra left the family trailer. She had done this before, walked off during periods of stress and come back when the pressure eased. John and the children assumed, when she didn't return by evening, that this was one of those times. She was processing. She would be back. She was not back. John reported her missing. He came under immediate suspicion in the way that husbands always do when wives disappear, particularly during divorces. He submitted to a polygraph examination. He passed. Investigators shifted focus. Nearby lakes were searched. Nothing was found. And then the search dogs went out. Here's the critical detail. The dogs tracked Sandra's scent from the trailer, down the road, to a payphone a short distance away. The same payphone, John Davis told investigators, that Sandra had used the night before she disappeared. The scent was real, and it was traceable, and it led directly to that phone booth on a Chugayak road on a summer morning in 1974. And then it stopped. Not gradually, not diffusing into the brush or the tree line or toward the lake. It stopped at the payphone. Clean. Final. The dogs had nothing after that point. This is where it stops being normal, and where 1974 becomes its own particular cruelty. There are no cameras on that road. There is no digital record of the calls she made or the number she dialed. There is no way, 50 years later, to know who picked up on the other end, what was said, whether someone came to get her, or whether she arranged something herself and walked away into a life nobody knew she was planning. Sandra had no money. She had no identification. She had no car and no known destination and no friends outside the family unit that was dissolving around her. She called someone from that payphone, and whoever she called, whatever she said, whatever came next, it is gone. It went with her. John Davis was cleared. No other suspects were developed. The investigation in 1974, Alaska, without surveillance and without digital trace and without the forensic tools that would eventually change what was possible to know. The investigation ran out of road at the payphone and stopped. What's left is a scent trail ending at a phone booth on a Chugayak road. A woman with no money and no identification, a call that nobody recorded. August 30th, 1974. 50 years of silence. Sandra disappeared quietly, alone, on a suburban road. Leonard Lane vanished in the middle of a crowd, in broad daylight, on the 4th of July, with hundreds of people around him, and not one of them noticed the moment he was gone. Fairbanks, Alaska, July 4th, 1995. Independence Day. The city is alive in the particular way that Fairbanks gets alive in summer, which is to say, fully and almost defiantly, because the winters are long and the darkness is total. And when the light comes back and the calendar turns to July, people in Fairbanks go outside and they stay outside. The 4th of July celebrations draw crowds into the streets and the parks, fireworks and music, and the kind of communal gathering that small northern cities do with a specific warmth, or a specific gratitude for warmth itself. It is, in the summer of 1995, a normal holiday in a normal American city that happens to sit 2 degrees south of the Arctic Circle. Leonard Lane is a World War II veteran. He is elderly. He has lived in Alaska long enough to be part of the fabric of the place, the kind of resident whose name people know and whose presence at a community event is unremarkable, expected even. He has no known reason to leave. No conflict, no crisis, no history of disappearing. He is stable and community-oriented, and he has come to the 4th of July celebrations the way he presumably came to other gatherings, as a participant, as a neighbor, as a man for whom this kind of day is exactly what it appears to be. At some point during the festivities, Leonard Lane is no longer there. Nobody saw him leave, and nobody reported a disturbance, a fall, a medical event, a conversation that looked wrong. The crowd moved and cheered and watched the fireworks, and somewhere inside that ordinary summer afternoon, Leonard Lane stepped out of the frame and did not step back in. By the time anyone noticed he was gone, by the time the absence registered against the noise and the movement of a public celebration, there was no trail to follow. Here's the critical detail about this case, and it requires sitting with a particular kind of discomfort. Fairbanks in July has nearly 24 hours of daylight. The sun barely sets. The sky above the 4th of July crowd is bright at 9 in the evening, bright at 10, bright at midnight. There is no cover of darkness to absorb a departure. There is no moment when the light failed and a man could have slipped away unnoticed because the visibility dropped. Whatever happened to Leonard Lane happened in conditions that should have made it impossible to miss. And still, nobody saw it. The search that followed covered Fairbanks and the surrounding area. Alaska state troopers were involved. The community, as communities in Alaska tend to do when one of their own goes missing, organized and looked. They found nothing. No vehicle abandoned at the edge of town. No clothing on a riverbank. No witness who could place Leonard Lane anywhere after the moment the crowd closed around the space where he had been standing. This is where it stops being normal. Though with Leonard Lane, it stopped being normal so quietly that the transition is almost invisible. There was no last text message. No security camera. No cell phone ping. No object left behind that pointed a direction. There was a man at a celebration, and then there was not a man at a celebration, and the distance between those two states contains nothing recoverable. The theories exist in the space that the evidence doesn't fill. A medical event, a cardiac episode, a stroke, the kind of sudden physiological collapse that can take a person down fast and quiet in a crowd if the crowd is loud enough and distracted enough. An elderly veteran at a fireworks display, the noise and the heat and the exertion of a summer day, and a body that simply stopped. It is possible. It is unconfirmed. No remains were ever found that would settle the question. The wilderness theory sits alongside it. Fairbanks is not a contained environment. The city bleeds into boreal forest at its edges, and the edges are not far from the center. A disoriented man walking in the wrong direction on a summer evening could cover ground faster than people realized he was gone, could move into tree cover before anyone thought to look that way, could be beyond easy search radius before the alarm was raised. Alaska has taken people that way. The wilderness pressing up against the ordinary. The margin between the city and the forest thinner than it looks on a map. What's left is a crowd and a gap in it. Fireworks over Fairbanks. One fewer person than there was an hour before. And no account, from any witness in any record, of the moment Leonard Lane became a missing person instead of a neighbor at a celebration. His case remains open. And the details in the public record are sparser than most of the cases in this documentary, and that sparseness is its own kind of testimony. About what gets documented, about whose disappearance generates sustained investigative attention, about the particular silence that can surround an elderly man who vanishes from a public event and leaves behind no dramatic evidence, no compelling narrative hook, just an absence where a person used to be. Leonard vanished from a celebration. The final case in this documentary is different in almost every dimension. Different decade, different geography, different age, different season. But it shares the quality that runs through every case on this list. The quality that makes Alaska's missing persons statistics what they are. Someone was there, and then they were not. And the land kept whatever it knew. Grayling, Alaska. December 23rd, 1989. Grayling, also known as Holokachuk, is a small Athabascan community on the Yukon River, roughly 300 miles from Anchorage as the crow flies, though the crow is often the only thing moving efficiently across that terrain in late December. The village has a population of approximately 170 people. It is accessible by small plane or by the river, which in December is frozen solid and has been for weeks. The nearest community of any size is McGrath, approximately 100 miles away. In late December, Grayling sits in 19 hours of darkness per day. The temperatures routinely drop to 20 below zero Fahrenheit and keep going. It is, by any measure, Mercury's one of the most remote and climatically demanding environments in which human beings have chosen to build a permanent community. Tina Mary Young is 17 years old. She is Athabascan, a lifelong Grayling resident, known in the village the way everyone is known in a community of 170 people. By family, by history, by the particular texture of daily life in a place where everyone's presence is noticed and everyone's absence is felt. It is 2 days before Christmas. There is no known reason for Tina to leave. No conflict on the record, no crisis, no indication that December 23rd, 1989 was anything other than a winter evening in a small village on a frozen river. Tina Young was last seen on December 23rd. The exact circumstances of that last sighting are unclear in the public record, and it would be wrong to fill that gap with invention, so it remains what it is, unclear. What is documented is that after that date, she was not seen again. She was reported missing. Alaska State Troopers were contacted. Here's the critical detail about what a search means in Grayling in late December of 1989. There are no roads out. The river is frozen, which eliminates boat access and also creates its own hazard. The Yukon in December has pressure ridges, thin spots, places where the ice that looks solid from the bank is not solid in the way that supports a person's weight. An air search in those temperatures, in that darkness, in that era, was constrained in every direction simultaneously. The cold grounded aircraft. The darkness shortened the window of useful visibility to a handful of hours per day. The terrain, the frozen river, under the boreal forest pressing up to the village edge, the tundra beyond it, offered no easy reading of where a person might have gone. A village-level search was conducted. It found nothing. This is where it stops being normal, and where the particular weight of this case settles in, if you let it. 170 people. In a community that size, in a village where everyone knows everyone, the geography of daily life is intimate in a way that urban disappearances are not. Someone should have seen something. Someone should have heard something. The distance you can travel in 19 hours of darkness at 20 below zero, without a snowmobile, without shelter, without gear. That distance is not large. The survival window in those conditions, without warmth, is measured in minutes to hours, not days. And yet, because no body was ever recovered. No evidence of what happened on the evening of December 23rd, 1989 has entered the public record in the 35 years since Tina Young disappeared. Her name is listed in the Alaska State Troopers Missing Persons database. It has been there for 3.5 decades with no update. Tina's case carries a context that this documentary acknowledges without editorializing. Indigenous women and girls in Alaska go missing at rates that are disproportionate to their share of the population. The systems designed to find them, the investigative resources, the media attention, the sustained institutional focus, have historically not matched the scale of the problem. Whether that disparity shaped what happened in Grayling in 1989, what search resources were deployed, how long the case remained active. Those questions sit in the record the way unanswered questions sit, quietly, accumulating weight over time. What's left is a name on a list. 19 hours of darkness. A frozen river running through a village of 170 people who woke up on December 24th, 1989, one person short, and have been waiting 35 years for an answer that has not come. The next part steps back from the individual cases and looks at what they share. 10 people, 6 decades, 1 state. The patterns are not comforting. 10 people. 6 decades. A state the size of 1/5 of the contiguous United States, with a road system that covers less than 1% of its land area, and a missing persons rate that sits among the highest of any state in the country, year after year after year. Before we get to the patterns, it is worth sitting for a moment with what this list actually represents. These are not 10 cases selected because they are the most dramatic or the most cinematic or the most likely to generate a reaction. These are 10 cases selected because the evidence behind them is verified. The sources are credible, and the disappearances are real. They represent a fraction, a small, documented fraction, of the people who have gone missing in Alaska since records began to be kept with any consistency. The Alaska State Troopers Missing Persons Database is not a short list. It has never been a short list. And for every case on it that has a Charlie Project page, an Anchorage Daily News investigation, a family with the resources and the persistence to keep pushing, there are cases that have none of those things. Names on a database entry, a date, a location, silence. That is the first pattern, and it runs through this entire documentary like a current beneath the surface of each individual case. Whose disappearance gets attention is not random. It follows lines that are familiar from every other context in which institutional attention is distributed unevenly. Thomas Nuzzi's friend Harold Guernsey said it plainly, without dressing it up. Middle-aged guy, they don't seem to care too much. Tina Young was 17 years old, indigenous, in a remote village in 1989, and her case has 35 years of silence in the public record. Marion Carver's family spent $75,000 of their own money to get answers that a functioning institutional response should have produced for free. Leonard Lane is elderly, yet his case sparse in the documentary record, the details thin in a way that reflects not the simplicity of what happened, but the simplicity of what was recorded. The cases where institutional attention was most sustained. Duffy Mernain, where a dedicated investigator was assigned solely to her case, are also the cases where the outcome, incomplete as it is, moved furthest toward resolution. Correlation is not causation, but the pattern is not invisible. Here's the critical detail about what these 10 cases share, underneath the surface differences of decade and location and setting type. In every single one of them, there is a moment, one specific moment, where the trail ends and the land begins. For Shanna, it is a cell tower ping near mile 17 and 6 miles of boreal corridor. For Thomas Nuzzi, it is a Jeep in an empty ski lot with keys in the ignition. For Jael Hamlin, it is a purse buried under 5 months of snow. For Duffy Mernain, it is a scent trail ending in the middle of Pioneer Avenue. For Marion Carver, it is a pair of shoes on a cabin floor and a deck 100 feet above the water. For Sue Knott and Karen McNeil, it is tracks at 15,800 feet, pressing toward a summit in a storm. For Richard Griffith, it is a man at a lodge on the White River, leaving some gear behind because he planned to return. For Sandra Davis, it is a scent trail ending at a payphone on a Chugayak road. For Leonard Lane, it is a gap in a crowd on the 4th of July. For Tina Young, it is a name in a database with a date in December 1989, and nothing after it. Each of those moments is a threshold. On one side of it, a person exists in the documentary record, on camera, in a cell signal, in a witness's memory, in a scent trail a dog can follow. On the other side of it, Alaska. And Alaska, in case after case after case, does not give the threshold back. This is where it stops being a collection of individual tragedies and becomes something with a shape. The geography is not incidental. Alaska has 663,000 square miles of land. it has roughly 736,000 people. That ratio, land to people, means that the margin between the inhabited world and the uninhabited world is thinner here than almost anywhere else in the United States. In Anchorage, the largest city, you can drive 20 minutes from downtown and be in terrain that search and rescue teams treat as remote wilderness. In Fairbanks, the boreal forest begins at the edge of residential neighborhoods. In Homer, the water is everywhere, and the distances between communities are long. In Grayling, the wilderness is not a concept or a weekend destination. It is the condition of existence, pressing in from every direction, present in the temperature and the darkness and the silence that fills the spaces between the houses. This matters for what happens when someone disappears. The search window, the period in which physical evidence is recoverable, in which scent trails hold, in which a person who is still alive might be reached, is compressed in Alaska in ways it is not compressed elsewhere. Cold degrades evidence fast. River currents move things far. Snow covers and preserves, and then reveals things in spring in locations miles from where they started. The physical record of a disappearance in Alaska deteriorates faster, hides more completely, and resurfaces less predictably than in almost any other environment. And then there is the institutional geography. Alaska state troopers cover a patrol area that is, in some districts, larger than entire eastern states, with a fraction of the personnel. The FBI's jurisdiction over crimes on federal land, national parks, wilderness areas, navigable waterways, adds a layer of coordination that sometimes works smoothly and sometimes produces the kind of jurisdictional ambiguity that characterized the Richard Griffith case, where the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Alaska State Troopers and the National Park Service all had partial ownership of the geography, and none of them had a complete picture. Here's what doesn't make sense. Just when you look at the institutional response across these 10 cases as a group rather than individually. 3 of them involved clear, documented, unambiguous institutional failure at the moment it mattered most. Marion Carver's supervisor told Domingo Montero to forget it, and a month passed before the FBI was called. Thomas Nuzzi's friend was told there were no available detectives, and the investigation stalled. Richard Griffith's friends expected him to winter over, and a year passed before anyone looked. In each of those cases, the failure was not a failure of available information. It was a failure of prioritization. Someone decided at a specific moment that this particular missing person was not worth the immediate expenditure of institutional resources. And by the time that decision was reversed, the recoverable evidence was gone. The pattern across all 10 cases, when you lay them flat and look at them together, is not random bad luck. It is a consistent relationship between a particular kind of environment and a particular kind of institutional capacity producing a particular kind of outcome. Alaska is large. The systems designed to find people in it are not scaled to its size. And the people who fall through the gap between those two facts are disproportionately the people who were already operating at the margins. The unhoused nurse on a layover, the elderly veteran at a celebration, the indigenous teenager in a remote village, the woman without a car or an identification walking to a payphone with no plan. The cases that moved toward resolution: Duffy Mernain, where a guilty plea was entered in 2026, and Sue Knott and Karen McNeil, where the National Park Service reached a considered institutional conclusion. Moved there because of sustained attention, a dedicated investigator, an organization with the resources to conduct 28 hours of aerial search. Attention, applied consistently over time, is the variable that separates the cases with partial answers from the cases with none. There is one more pattern worth naming, and it is the one that sits underneath all the others, the one that the geography and the institutions and the individual circumstances all rest on. Every person on this list was, at the moment they disappeared, doing something ordinary. Shanna was getting a ride home. Thomas was buying cigarettes before a flight. Jael was going to sleep after dinner. Duffy was walking to a doctor's appointment, and Marion was going up to the deck to look at the water. Sue and Karen were climbing a mountain they were qualified to climb. Richard was testing an invention he believed in. Sandra was walking to a phone. Leonard was watching fireworks. Tina was living her life in the village where she had always lived. None of them stepped into a situation they understood to be dangerous. None of them made a decision that, from the outside, looks like a clear error. They were all, in the moment before the threshold, doing what people do, moving through the world with the ordinary confidence that the world will hold them. Alaska held something else instead. The final part of this documentary returns to where we started. The map, the triangle, the darkness between the dots. And to the 10 names, one more time, as with what was found and what was never found, and what the silence between those two things costs the people still waiting on the other side of it. Pull up the map again. Alaska, 663,000 square miles. The triangle's still there. Anchorage, Fairbanks, the Arctic coast, and the darkness between the dots exactly as wide as it was at the beginning of this documentary, exactly as wide as it has always been. Nothing we covered in the last 10 parts made it smaller. That is the thing about this kind of darkness. It does not respond to documentation. It does not shrink because someone named it. Let's go through them one more time. Not for drama, because they deserve to be named, specifically, at the end of the story, the same way they were named at the beginning. As people, with details, with a particular weight of what was found and what was never found, and what the distance between those two things has cost the people who loved them. Shanna Marie Oman, 39 years old, Eagle River native, mother of 3 daughters. She left her money behind. She left her dog behind. A cell tower near mile 17 on Chena Hot Springs Road caught the last signal from her dying phone on June 4th, 2019. And after that, the boreal corridor gave nothing back. No remains, no clothing, no confirmation of what the Chena River did or did not take that night. Her daughters are still waiting. The river is still moving. Thomas Anthony Nuzzi, 52 years old, registered nurse, Vietnam veteran. A gas station receipt stamped 9:47 in the evening on June 18th. 2001 is the last confirmed image of him alive. His Jeep sat in an empty ski lot 12 miles from his motel with the keys in the ignition. 2 strangers occupied his hotel room and answered his phone and were never identified. He was supposed to be in Bethel the next morning. He never boarded that flight. No remains, no resolution. The woman from the gas station footage still has no name in any public record. Jael Hamlin, 20 years old, pink hair, a black pea coat. A baby boy named Joel who was too young to remember her face. She walked out of her apartment in high heels in sub-freezing temperatures sometime after 3 in the morning on October 12th, 2014. And 5 months later, hikers found her purse buried in the snow in Chugiak, 20 miles from where she lived. The purse was placed there by someone else. 2 men received her texts that night, and neither has been publicly charged. Neither has been publicly cleared. No remains. Joel is old enough now to ask questions. Anisha Mernain, 38 years old. Duffy to everyone who loved her. A master's degree in education. A 1-mile walk to a doctor's appointment on a clear October afternoon in Homer, Alaska. The search dogs lost her scent in the middle of Pioneer Avenue and called it a car pickup. In February 2026, Kirby Calderwood, a former employee at her building, entered a guilty plea. Her remains have never been found. Her mother, Sarah, cannot bury her daughter. The sentencing is scheduled. The grave does not exist yet. Marion Lynn Carver, 40 years old, Cambridge, Massachusetts, former investment banker. She left her shoes in her cabin on the celebrity cruises Mercury on the night of August 28, 2004, beat her and went up to the deck and was never seen again. Her belongings were donated to charity. The FBI was called 5 weeks later. Her father spent $75,000 and the rest of his active years fighting for legislation that now bears the weight of what happened to his daughter. Bones were found on Mary Island. The DNA question remains unanswered in the public record. The manila envelope on the nightstand, its contents unknown, its meaning unresolved, is still the most disturbing object in a case full of disturbing objects. Sue Knott and Karen McNeil, 36 and 37 years old, the two most accomplished female alpinists in North America by most assessments. They registered as Turtle Team. They packed 14 days of food and fuel. They climbed the Infinite Spur on Mount Foraker in May 2006, and their tracks were last identified at 15,800 feet, pressing toward a summit in 60-mile-per-hour winds. Sue's backpack was found in an avalanche debris field at 11,500 feet, with the sleeping bag still inside and the radio batteries still good. The National Park Service concluded they built a snow cave near the summit and did not survive it. Their bodies have never been found. Mount Foraker has been climbed many times since 2006. The mountain has not returned them. Richard Lyman Griffith, inventor, wanderer. He walked into the wilderness between the White River and McCarthy in the summer of 2006, carrying a bright orange survival cocoon he had built himself, designed to keep a person alive in exactly the conditions he was walking into, designed to be visible from the air in exactly the terrain he was crossing. A year passed before anyone reported him missing. The cocoon has never been found. 13 million acres of Wrangell St. Elias country have not given back a single orange fiber. The device built to be found has not been found. Sandra Davis, a mother of two, Chugiak, Alaska, August 30th, 1974. The search dogs tracked her scent to a payphone on a road near her home, and the scent ended there, clean and final, the way scent ends when someone gets into a vehicle. She had no money. She had no identification. She made a call from that phone to someone whose name is not in any record. Whatever she said, whatever was arranged, and whatever came next, it went with her into 50 years of silence. No remains, no confirmed sighting. The payphone is gone now. The silence isn't. Leonard Lane, World War II veteran, longtime Fairbanks resident. He went to the 4th of July celebrations in 1995, and at some point during the fireworks, he was no longer there. Nobody saw him leave. Nobody reported anything unusual. The crowd cheered and the sky lit up, and somewhere in the noise and the light, a man stepped out of the world, and the world did not notice until it was too late to follow. No remains, no witnesses. A gap in a crowd where a person used to be. Tina Mary Young, 17 years old, Athabaskan, Grayling, Alaska, December 23rd, 1989. A village of 170 people on a frozen river in 19 hours of darkness at 20 below zero. She was last seen 2 days before Christmas and has not been seen since. Her name has been in the Alaska State Troopers Missing Persons database for 35 years. There have been no updates. The Yukon River has frozen and thawed 35 times since the winter she disappeared. The entry in the database does not change. 10 people, different decades, different settings, different ages, different circumstances, different lives. What connects them is not a single killer or a single cause or a single failure of a single institution. What connects them is a threshold, the moment each of them stepped out of the documented world and into the undocumented one. The moment the camera ended, the signal died, the scent stopped, the tracks ran out. The moment Alaska became the only witness, and Alaska, as this documentary has tried to show, keeps its own counsel. 3 of these cases involved institutional failures so clear and so consequential that they belong in a different category than simple tragedy. The supervisor who told Domingo Montero to forget it. The police department that had no available detectives for a missing man. The friends who expected Richard Griffith to winter over and let a year pass before anyone looked. In each of those cases, the failure was a choice, not a natural disaster, not an unavoidable consequence of geography, not the indifferent mathematics of wilderness and cold. A choice made by a person to treat a missing human being as someone else's problem. And in each case, that choice destroyed the window in which the truth was recoverable. That is the thing that stays with you. After 10 cases and 6 decades and 663,000 square miles of the largest state in the country. Not the wilderness, not the cold, not the rivers or the mountains or the distances that make Alaska what it is. The wilderness is what it is. The cold does what cold does. What stays with you is the choices. The small, mundane, bureaucratic choices made by people in warm buildings who decided, in the specific moment when it mattered, that this particular missing person could wait. Some of them are still waiting. The map is still there. The triangle, the 3 dots, the darkness between them exactly as wide as it was when we started. Somewhere in those 663,000 square miles, there are answers. There are remains in river sediment and snow caves and boreal forest and frozen ground that has not been disturbed since the winter of 1989. There are answers that the land is holding the way the land holds everything. Without urgency, without conscience, without any particular interest in the questions being asked on this side of the threshold. The problem is not that Alaska doesn't know. The problem is that Alaska keeps its secrets better than we keep our people.